Hello and welcome back to Bookish, and welcome to my fourth attempt at a review of Gone with the Wind, Margaret Mitchell's epic sweeping novel of the Old South, the Civil War, and Reconstruction, featuring one of the most well-known heroines probably in all of American literature, Scarlett O'Hara. The reason why I keep reshooting this is my video turns out to be too long. There are two parts to my video. One half is a review of the book itself, and the second half is a description of why I hate the book and why I think it is so damaging. So first, just a really quick, hopefully, review of the book and things I thought were strengths and weaknesses. I assume most people know that Gone with the Wind is the story of a young girl who grew up on a plantation called Tara in Georgia in the years before the Civil War, and her trials and tribulations, both with her love life, she's in love with another man's wife, and the Civil War. The Civil War wrecks her family's plantation of Tara and leaves them poor and destitute. Her efforts to regain and save her home of Tara, which apparently is the most important thing to her, her desperate attempt to make money and to be rich, her three marriages, none of whom to the man she really loves for most of the book, one out of spite, one for money, and a second for fun and money, and how those work out. The relationship between Scarlett O'Hara and Rhett Butler is kind of legendary as an example of tumultuous relationship between two very hard-headed, determined, fairly immoral people is kind of famous, and I think is really what drives the story, what makes the book have some interest. And beyond that, for a plot summary, I'm going to leave it at that. There are four main characters in the book. Scarlett O'Hara, who is selfish, self-interested, self-indulgent. She is manipulative. She is uses other people. She is unscrupulous. At the same time, she is a lot tougher than anybody gave her credit for. She does save her family home. She is an independent-minded woman, which would be unusual, particularly for the 1860s, but also even in the 1930s. She has a lot of independence and a lot of strength. At the same time, she is completely unaware of what's going on around her unless it involves her directly. She doesn't understand the politics of Reconstruction. She doesn't even know that her own husband is in the Ku Klux Klan. She doesn't know the man that she loves, Ashley Wilkes, is in the Ku Klux Klan until it all comes out. And she is essentially just completely selfish, but strong and independently minded character who marries three men for various reasons, none of which are love, but in the end realizes she doesn't love Ashley Wilkes, who was married to another woman. She actually loves Rhett Butler just in time for him to leave her because he is finally tired of her. Rhett Butler is the main male character, I suppose, and he is unscrupulous. He is almost completely amoral. He has a terrible reputation. He is a profiteer. He is, a thief. He is in some ways a pimp, in the traditional sense of the term, but he is in love with Scarlett O'Hara, and while as different from Southern society as he seems for most of the book, in the aftermath of the Civil War, he becomes a traditionalist, upholding some of the values, trying to uphold the values of Southern society, particularly those values of Southern society represented by Melanie Wilkes, who is married to Ashley. Melanie Wilkes, who Scarlett saves from Atlanta, saves her and her baby from Atlanta just as the Yankees pull into town. Melanie, who is completely loyal to Scarlett and who upholds all the old Southern values with the exception of being willing to, break or reach out across class barriers from time to time in the years after the Civil War. But she is an upholder of the white supremacist society. She is aware that her husband Ashley is the leader of the Atlanta KKK, and she supports that effort. She has former Confederates to dinner in her home, including Alexander Stephens, the author, the Vice President of the Confederacy, and the author of the Cornerstone speech, in which he declared the Confederacy was founded on the principles of white supremacy. Melanie upholds all those ideas. And then we have Ashley Wilkes, the man that, Scarlett really is in love with, who is the definition of wishy-washy. And I defy anybody who's read Gone with the Wind to figure out why Scarlett is in love with Ashley. He is a romantic, he is a dreamer,
He is not strong enough to fight against the things other people want him to do. He goes off to the Civil War. He fights. He's, an admirable soldier. When, Southern society tells him that, we need to form the Klan to kill black people, he goes along with that. But he is otherwise almost completely useless as a farmer, as a business person, and he apparently has no interest in learning any of those things. And Scarlet only realizes these things about Ashley at the end of the book. So just kind of in terms of how I think about the book, I will say that I think Mitchell does a great job with kind of set pieces. She has some really vivid and page-turning set pieces. When the Yankees come to Atlanta and Scarlet and Melanie and her baby and Rhett are escaping, that's a very powerful scene. The scenes in the hospital where Scarlet works as a nurse, very powerful, very well done. The initial scenes where Scarlet goes back to Tara and finds, no food, no nothing, her mother dead, the crops all taken, the animals all gone, and is hungry, very well done. The scene in which, Scarlet does find out that her husband, Frank Kennedy, and Ashley Wilkes were part of the Klan, and they've gone out to attack villages of African Americans from which someone who had attacked Scarlet came. That scene is very well done. There are very good scenes in the book, and Mitchell, I think, creates those scenes quite vividly. And I think that's a strength. I think the tension between Scarlett O'Hara and Rhett Butler is fairly well done, if I think it's somewhat overplayed in the end. I think that situation is well done. I think there are memorable characters in the book. Scarlett, Rhett, I think Melanie is a memorable character in the book. And so those are strengths of the books. But as I said, the book is overwritten. It is melodramatic, and I don't really think it makes sense. So we are told that the thing Scarlett cares about most is Tara, her family home. And when she goes back there during the Civil War and finds it destroyed, she is determined to rebuild it, and she wants to hold on to the land, and she will fight to, make the farm prosper so she can pay the taxes. And when they can't pay the taxes, she's willing to debase herself and become Rhett Butler's mistress if he'll just give her the money to pay the taxes. And when that doesn't happen, she marries Frank Kennedy for his money so she can pay the tax. We're told that she's willing to do anything to save Tara, but once she's saved it, she almost never goes back there. It hardly ever comes up. And what we find out is that what she really loves is money and wealth and fancy clothes and Ashley Wilkes and, being able to lord her wealth and her position and her beauty over other people, which, is hardly the admirable qualities. On the good side, Scarlett is tough. She's a lot stronger than I think anybody thinks she would be. But, I do have definite problems with that as kind of a real flaw in the story. Her main motivating factor isn't her motivation for the last half of the book. That to me is problematic. Melanie's in lots of ways supposed to be the opposite of Scarlett. She upholds all the Southern womanly virtues, whereas Scarlett breaks with those norms, and yet Melanie's incredibly loyal, and she is almost too good to be true. But then she does something incredibly stupid. She becomes pregnant, even though she's been told by a doctor that a second pregnancy will kill her. She becomes pregnant anyway. And by the way, Ashley's more than willing to impregnate his wife and kill her. And guess what? She dies, which also brings me another problem I have with the book, and that is that Margaret Mitchell literally telegraphs everything that's going to happen. Any piece of action that happens, you knew ahead of time it was going to happen because Margaret Mitchell warned you it could happen. And to me, this is just, maybe that's part of the melodrama, but to me, this is just bad writing. It's not that everything has to be a surprise, but, having a doctor say if Melanie gets pregnant again, she could die, and have Melanie getting pregnant and dying seems like a little more than foreshadowing, and it's heavy-handed. And so there are lots of things about the book as a book I didn't like, and so I would rate the book as okay. There are too many good set-piece writing examples, I think, of action, etc., to rate the book as bad, but I would just rank it as okay. So that's kind of my review of Gone with the Wind as a book. So now I want to talk about why I hate Gone with the Wind. Despite what I said about the book being an okay novel and being able to see, I think, the strengths of the novel, I hate Gone with the Wind. And the reason I hate Gone with the Wind is for the impact I believe it had on American society and our inability to deal frankly with and honestly with the racist past in the United States, the Civil War, the legacy of slavery, and so on. And the reason why I blame Gone with the Wind, at least in part for that, is because Gone with the Wind was so incredibly popular. In movie and in book form, it is probably the source of at least part of what lots of Americans know or think about the Civil War, and that is a terrifying thought. Because what Gone with the Wind tells us about the Civil War and slavery and Reconstruction is incredibly inaccurate. It is intentionally romanticized, apologistic BS, essentially, about what the South was really like, about what the Civil War was really like, about what slavery was like, about what Reconstruction was like, and perhaps most damning, I think, about, the Ku Klux Klan and, why Mitchell decided the Ku Klux Klan was necessary. So, in that respect, I kind of see Gone with the Wind in opposition, perhaps, to Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe, which historically a lot of people think helped encourage growing abolitionism in the North, and therefore led the North to oppose the expansion of slavery, which then causes the South to believe that slavery is under threat, and that then leads to the Civil War. And so if Uncle Tom's Cabin can have that impact, then I think it's perfectly reasonable to assume that Gone with the Wind has as well. And again, that description, Mitchell's description and her view, which become popular views of the Old South and slavery, are really damaging. So I wanted to read you some specific quotations from the book about how it portrays violence and Reconstruction and slavery and all those things. So if you don't know, Reconstruction is the time period in American history after the Civil War in which essentially we were trying to rebuild the country, trying to bring the 11 Confederate states back into the United States of America. And it was a difficult task, made more difficult by incredible resistance and opposition by white Southerners to anything which would approximate equality or equal rights for African Americans. So what Mitchell does consistently in the novel is she portrays Reconstruction as vengeance, as the North taking out its revenge on the South, as the North trying to put African Americans in charge of Southern states, and as the North literally kind of hating the South. So I have two quotes from you here that are really closely related. By the way, before I get into this, let me just say that Gone with the Wind is one of the most racist books I've ever read. Racist in its language, racist in its ideas, racist from top to bottom at its core. It is a racist novel. The N-word is used constantly throughout the book. The high-class white Southerners rarely use the N-word. They use it. They rarely use the N-word, but their substitution, and forgive me for this racist term, their substitution is to call African Americans darkies. It's just, the racism is there, and it's prevalent, and it is at the core of this book, and you will see that in the quotes I read, which are about Reconstruction, beginning with this one. The Negroes had not yet been given the right to vote, but the North was determined they should vote, and equally determined their vote should be friendly to the North. With this in mind, nothing was too good for the Negroes. The Yankee soldiers backed them up in anything they chose to do, and the surest way for a white person to get himself in trouble was to bring complaint of any kind against a Negro. Notice that she is clearly portraying white Southerners as the victims. Moving on. White Southerners who owned slaves and who fought a treasonous war against the United States to protect the institution of slavery. Continuing on with that quote, the former slaves were now lords of creation, and with the aid of the Yankees, the lowest and most ignorant ones were on top. The better class of them, scorning freedom, were suffering as severely as their white masters. Here is a common racist trope from the Old South, and that is that there were good African Americans and bad African Americans, and the good African Americans were the ones who went along with whatever white society suggested, even denying themselves freedom. So there's that. Then the second quote is this, aided by the unscrupulous adventurers who operated the Freemans Bureau and urged on by a fervor of northern hatred, almost religious in its fanaticism, the former field hands found themselves suddenly elevated to the seats of the mighty. Number one, the Freemans Bureau was an organization designed to help the African Americans who had been freed from slavery adjust to a life of freedom. That's what their mission was. They did, horrible things like, open schools for African Americans so they could learn to read and write and teach them job skills and provide them with legal representation. That's the horrible, awful, terrible thing the Freemans Bureau did. Notice how she mischaracterizes the Freemans Bureau. And she suggests that the North is putting in place Reconstruction because it hates the South fanatically. Continuing on. So, continuing on there, that being the newly freed African Americans. There, they conduct themselves as creatures of small intelligence might naturally be expected to do. Margaret Mitchell has just called African Americans creatures of small intelligence. Going on, and again, forgive the racism. Like monkeys, or small children turned loose among treasured objects whose value is beyond their comprehension. They're like animals or kids who don't understand what has value, according to Mitchell. And continue on, they ran wild, either from perverse pleasure in destruction or simply because of their ignorance. African Americans are, according to Mitchell, African Americans were ignorant. And they were like children. They were like animals. They were like monkeys. That portrayal of African Americans and the way in which Reconstruction was described is incredibly racist and incredibly, white victim whining, making themselves out to be the victim. It is staggering in its ignorance to me. To make matters worse, Mitchell consistently mischaracterizes slavery. There are so many examples of this. I only chose two. But essentially Mitchell's point of view is the war really wasn't about slavery, except the North wanted to free the slaves because the North hated the South. The war was about something else, and that, slavery wasn't that bad. Here, she has someone explain to Scarlet about slavery. I think it's Ashley. He says, but that was different. Slaves were neither miserable nor unfortunate. They were both. They were deprived of freedom. They were constantly the victims of violence. Their wives and daughters could be raped with impunity. Their family members could be sold away. They could be killed. They worked every waking hour of the day. They ate very little food. They were poorly housed and poorly clothed, and they worked their lives away to benefit their owners. Those people were miserable and unfortunate. Sorry, going back to the quote. So this, continuing on with the quote from Mitchell. The Negroes were far better off under slavery than they were now under freedom. That slavery for African Americans better than freedom. On another example, someone is explaining to Scarlet why they would never use convict labor. Ashley says, I can't make money from the enforced labor and misery of others. Scarlet replies, quite rightly, but you own slaves. Ashley lies and says, they weren't miserable, and besides, I would have freed them all when Father died if the war hadn't actually freed them. Okay, number one, slaves were miserable. Number two, there's no indication anywhere in the novel that Ashley would have freed the slaves. His character wants to lay around and think romantic thoughts and read books. That's what he wants to do, and that lifestyle is not possible for people like Ashley without slave labor. The book also continually justifies racist violence. To give you just one example, or to give you several examples. Here, Mitchell is describing what happens to an African American man who'd been accused of rape and why what happened to him was justified. On page 372, a Negro who had boasted of rape had actually been arrested, but before he could be brought to trial, the jail had been raided by the Ku Klux Klan and he had been quietly hanged. Number one, no one was ever quietly hung. No African American was ever quietly lynched. They were tortured and they were killed in a brutal way. Continuing on the quote, the Klan had acted to save the as yet unnamed victim from having to testify in open court. They killed this man without a trial. Rather than have her appear and advertise her shame, her father and brother would have shot her. So, lynching the Negro seemed a sensible solution to the townspeople. In fact, the only decent solution possible. The only decent solution was either to kill the woman who was supposedly the victim of this African American rapist, or to kill the African American man without a trial. Continuing on, another example of racist violence. At one point, Scarlet helps an old family friend of hers escape from the military because he'd killed an African American man, and here's his justification. Again, excuse the racism. He says, you remember that black buck Eustace who used to be our foreman? Yes, says Scarlet. Came to the kitchen door today while Sal was fixing dinner, and I don't know what he said to her. I guess I'll never know. But he said something, and I heard her scream, and I ran into the kitchen, and there he was, drunk. There he was, drunk. I bet there he was, drunk as a fiddler's bee. I beg your pardon, Scarlet just slipped out. Go on, she says. I shot him. He shot a man, an African-American man, for saying something that made a female member of his family scream. There is racist violence throughout the book. Rhett Butler is, when famously Scarlet makes the dress out of the drapes at Tara, and she goes to visit Rhett Butler to ask him for money. He's in prison. He's in prison for killing an African-American man. He's eventually let off, and he doesn't have to, he doesn't, remain in prison. But he later confesses to Scarlet that in fact he had killed the African-American man for being impudent and talking to a white woman. He'd killed an African-American man for being impudent in the way he talked to a white woman. An African-American man died for the way in which he spoke to a white woman. And that's justified in the book. And Rhett Butler is viewed as, at least one of the heroes. This also then leads to, I think, what is, at heart really, one of Mitchell's main points, and that is that the Ku Klux Klan were heroes and that they were doing the right thing. I already read you the one example about the Klan killing the African-American man so that the woman didn't have to testify and her family didn't have to kill her. I mean, that's a pretty WTF moment in and of itself. But continuing on, Mitchell writes, there were thousands of women like her all over the South who were frightened and helpless, and thousands of men who had laid down their arms at Appomattox had taken them up again and stood ready to risk their necks on a minute's notice to protect these women. Mitchell continues with the fiction that African-American men freed from slavery were roaming the countryside and raping white women. There's no evidence of that to be true, and the irony is that African-American women who were enslaved were constantly under the threat of rape and being raped by white men without any kind of recourse. And then even longer explanation of this, Mitchell writes, but these ignominies and dangers were nothing compared to the peril of white women, many bereft by the war of male protection, who lived alone in outlying districts and on lonely roads. It was the large number of outrages on women and the ever-present fear for the safety of their wives and daughters that drove Southern men to cold, trembling fury and caused the Ku Klux Klan to spring up overnight. And it was against this nocturnal organization that newspapers in the North cried out most loudly, never realizing the tragic necessity that brought it into being. She says the Ku Klux Klan, a terrorist organization which terrorized African Americans and made life in the South impossible for Reconstruction governments, was a necessity. The North wanted every member of the Ku Klux Klan hunted down and hanged because they had dared to take the punishment of a crime into their own hands at a time when the ordinary process of law and order had been overthrown by their invaders. I hate this book. I hate everything that came from this book. The idea that Southern gentlemen were fighting for the Southern way of life, that the war wasn't about slavery, that African American men were just seeking to rape white women, that Reconstruction was corrupt, the racism in the book. All of these ideas permeate throughout the book, and I believe were put there by Mitchell intentionally to rehabilitate the image of the South in the 1930s. It's important to remember that Mitchell's writing in the 1930s, not the 1850s. She is writing in a period of time in which the Ku Klux Klan has risen to power again. It had peaked again in the 1920s. She's writing during a period of time in which lynchings were still going on across the South. I believe there were 8 in the South in the year in which Gone with the Wind was actually written. She's writing in a time period in which African Americans had gained some measure of greater acceptance thanks to the Harlem Renaissance and the Great Migration North, and she is writing an intensely racist, Klan apologizing, lost cause spreading myth of a novel. And I truly believe that it colored the way in which Americans viewed the Civil War and slavery and the South, and it made it more difficult for us to come to grips with our racist past. Anyway, there you go. There's my review of Gone with the Wind and why I hate it. 2 separate parts of the review. I look forward to your comments in the comment section below, and as always, thank you for watching.